Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Haynes, and I'm the co-director of the Reuben Mark Initiative for Organizational Character and Leadership at Columbia University. And on behalf of the initiative, I'm happy to welcome you to our organizational leadership series featuring a conversation with Vicki Kroviak, founder and CEO of Acorn Health, and a man that needs no introduction, Professor Todd Jick, faculty director of the Reuben Mark Initiative for Organizational Character and Leadership at Columbia Business School. Today's program is a featured event as part of the initiative, which leverages the intellectual capital of Columbia Business and Law Schools to design courses and programs that teach the leadership skills and strategies necessary to create optimal organizational cultures. The aim of our organizational leadership series is to host preeminent business and legal executives from various industries to highlight their effective leadership styles in congruence with their company's strong organizational cultures. And today, we have a fantastic conversation with a truly humanistic leader in tow. To kick things off, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Jick. If you are a CBS student or alumni, you know him from his popular courses, Org Change and Advanced Org Change, which probably drained all of your bid points. And Professor Jick is one of the leading experts in leadership at Org Change and has been a notable figure in this field for more than 40 years, although he doesn't look over the age of 21. Before handing it over to Professor Jick, a quick note that we will all be taking questions throughout the event, so please drop it in the Q&A box, which will be monitored. And so once again, thank you for joining us, and I'll be handing it over to Professor Jick to get us started. Thanks again.
Olivia, thank you very much. That's an all too kind introduction, as I will in turn provide for Vicki. So we'll have introduction of introduction. Thanks to everyone for being here, current students, former students, colleagues, and the like. It's a delight to have everyone here. Both Vicki and I are a little bit saddened that we don't have a screen to see all your faces, but we're giving you this sort of relaxed time of being off camera for this session. I'm going to add to what Olivia said to just say that I think we're going to have a very interesting session with an upfront and close conversation with a leader who I have found to be highly unusual and unusually effective. You can have unusual, unconventional, but kind of kooky and not effective, and you can have effective, but rather mainstream. Vicki's the right combination. She's unusual in some of her values and experiences and commitments and mission and things that we'll talk about, and unusually effective in what she has done thus far in her career, which has still got plenty of years ahead of her. She doesn't have a 40-year time frame. Thank goodness for her. I'm going to quickly just highlight a few things from her bio. Hopefully you've all seen that in the preparatory materials, but obviously Vicki is the founder and CEO of Acorn Health. In a few moments, I'm going to ask Vicki to tell you about Acorn Health. It's probably not known to most of you, but it's a leading provider of applied behavioral analysis treatment for children with autism and their families. Therefore, it is a highly important feature of the healthcare field, healthcare industry, and an interesting one because it was founded in 2018 when she partnered with a PE firm, MBF Healthcare Partners, to build out a provider network. And she'll tell you perhaps more about that, but the company is really in motion now in terms of growing and expanding across parts of the country. Today, there are 600 employees, if I'm not mistaken, Vicki, and still growing. Vicki was previously the chief executive officer of Montanito and Affiliates and co-founder of Oliver Pyatt Centers, a leading provider of residential eating disorder treatment. She comes to this with some personal connections to a personal sort of belief system about the importance of this kind of health treatment as a provider, but also in her own words, as a mother, delivering the standard of care she would want for her own children. And in fact, as a mother of 3 daughters, one of whom is indeed has special needs, Acorn's mission is something very personal to Vicki. I also want to note, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the session, that she's a Brene Brown, B-R-E-N-E, Brown, certified Dare to Lead facilitator. You tell me which CEO you've encountered recently is a Brene Brown certified Dare to Lead or facilitator. Some of you may know Brene Brown, and Vicki will tell you about those principles, but she's used those principles to build out Acorn Health and develop the kind of team, as she would call it, of daring leaders and a courageous workplace culture that, again, I think is fairly unusual and impressive. So that, I think, is more than enough, Vicki, to just say welcome to Columbia Business School and Columbia Law School and to the Reuben Mark Initiative. Delighted to welcome you today.
Thank you so much. You got to intro me everywhere. I really liked that.
Well,
I
I'm not
that usual part. I liked it a lot.
Well, I believe it. I believe it. So Vicki and I have been working together really for 3 or 4 months because I've had the privilege of writing a case study about Acorn Health. And so with all your accomplishments, let's add this in. There is a CBS case study called CBS The Core Values in a Time of Crisis, Confronting COVID-19 at Acorn Health. And it had its premiere in January in my advanced org change course. And you came to the class with a number of your colleagues. So another highlight, I hope, for you in your experience. How was it coming to a CBS classroom? How was that? In fact, you spent the whole morning with us. How was it?
Yeah, it was really such a joy, I have to say, because the whole experience for us of kind of navigating the COVID crisis as a healthcare company, all the issues with, everything that our families were experiencing, everything that our employees were experiencing. And we were just in the trenches, sort of surviving that phase in a lot of ways. So it was so great to hear their perspective, the questions that they were asking. It really made us feel good because it lined up with a lot of the questions that we had asked. And they were so engaged and just had a great perspective on it. So it was really, we appreciated it a lot. It was a joy.
Well, I saw, at least on the pre-registration, a number of them were going to sit in today. So they're happy to hear that, because I was going to ask you, were they well behaved? Sounds like they were actually well behaved.
Yeah, I got lovely notes from them afterwards too. And some of them told me that they were going to be coming today. So I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Great. Well, that was a premiere of a case that I hope will have many years of longevity at CBS and around the world, because it helps tell the story we now want to talk about. How you sort of founded this company, how you built it up over the last few years, and look at that, you built it up just in time for the pandemic to hit. And we have a section of the case called Friday, March 13th.
That's
you don't
right.
want to have a Friday the 13th in your experience, but you did Friday, March 13th, 2020. And we'll come to that and to that crisis and sort of what you've learned as a leader. So help us, because again, most people wouldn't be familiar necessarily with Acorn Health. Give us the basic sort of facts and figures of the company, its founding, a little bit, that we can understand then the story of how you built it, the culture, and some of the characteristics I characterize as unusual.
Yeah, sure. It's a private equity-backed healthcare company focused, as you said, on treatment services for kids with autism. We actually, I think the numbers that you gave, Professor Jick, were from a few months ago. So we actually have over 1,000 employees. We're serving 1,300 clients. We're in 7 states now. So we've grown a lot since then. And Acorn was really born through a partnership with MBF Healthcare Partners. And when I, as you mentioned, I have a behavioral healthcare background. I had started an eating disorder treatment company with my college roommate. And after I left that company and was figuring out what I wanted to do next, I was really interested in the autism sector. Again, I have the personal connection, right? So I have, my middle daughter has significant special needs. I really felt like I had an understanding of what was needed in the sector. It was very early stage, similar to the eating disorder industry when I had joined. And I talked to a lot of different private equity groups about building something ground up, which is unusual for PE. So I know that a lot of your students and maybe a lot of our listeners are looking to go into private equity, and that's not typical, right? To partner with a private equity company ground up, that's typically what you see with venture capital. But in some emerging sectors, it's really the only way where there's huge need and there's so much growth, kind of doing it that way is one of the only ways to enter the sector. And had a lot of conversations with MBF about what I wanted to build, what I thought was important, what I thought the sector needed because of what the families needed. And that's when we started Acorn. So it's only been, I guess, about 2.5 years now.
Let's take it from there. That's very helpful background, and thanks for updating me on the numbers. It's making the point the company is growing, and if not leaps and bounds, certainly pretty significant, since you've got 400 more people from the last time I checked in. And we'll come to even that question of how you acquire companies and how they'll match some of the cultural characteristics. But let's talk about, in a sense, your leadership of the culture that you formed. My experience with startups, even this kind of situation of sort of a build-up, is that there are a lot of issues that a young company has to face. Obviously, there's hiring, and there's the business model, and there's the sponsorship, as you're talking about, and there's relationship with vendors, and 1,000 other things probably in a regulatory way that you have to face. And my experience is a lot of those companies leave for last the question of codifying their culture or making it more explicit. And you did not leave it for last. And I think it's important, maybe just begin with just sort of at the high level, why is culture so important to you? And then let's talk about the values that you in fact did sort of invest in creating. But where did that come from in your background or your own sort of ideology to make that a centerpiece of the development of the company? Not just later on, we'll talk about it, but at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that one, I was always drawn to those things. I've seen in my past experiences, the value that culture can have in terms of that alignment, that momentum that can be created when you have the right culture in an organization. And I have also lived when it was wrong, right? So I would say what drew me to the Brené Brown work and doing that training with her, and most of the people who did that training with her were actually people who were executive coaches. I wanted to do the training with her because I wanted to actually implement it within an organization, right? Which was different. And that was born out of what I think were mistakes in the past and times where I had really experienced integration issues, change management issues, and struggled with cultural alignment and had learned a lot of things. And I think it just goes to my overall philosophy, which is what we call the soft stuff, right, is really the hard stuff, right? So all of the people stuff, the leadership, the interpersonal dynamics on a leadership team, that's the really hard stuff and the most important stuff, and why I wanted to focus on it from the beginning.
And you manifest that in part by, well, the importance of hiring the right kind of people.
That's right.
And then coalescing them into kind of a DNA that was co-created with those people.
That's right.
So just say a little bit about the selection process and then how you brought people together to brainstorm about the values. And then let's talk about the I think it's 5 values, I'm not mistaken, 5 or 6 that you came up with, yeah, which I think are interesting itself. But a little bit about the process, because again, I think a leader's involvement in this kind of process detail is unusual, that you cared enough to not only be ideologically in favor of it, but you personally were involved in it.
Very, very involved in it. I think it's, one thing that's always good to remember is there are norms and values and culture, whether you invest in it or not, it's going to exist. And by naming it, by engaging everyone in what it is, that's your ability to influence it, right? And to impact the organization. So for us, we went through the whole exercise of the values exercise. And it began with really who are the stellar employees in the organization, and what are the people that everybody wants to work with, right? The ones where all the way down on the ground at an individual facility level, who are the ones that when you walk into one of our centers, the person who's got a shift with you, you're happy that person is there, and you know that you've got a real partner in your work that day. And basically capturing those attributes. And we just had a big whiteboard list, and we ran it up and down the organization. We got feedback and input the whole time. And that's how we landed on the big 5. And really, I think a lot of organizations go that far. Maybe, I don't know if they gather them in the same way that we did. But I think a lot go that far so that they have them on the wall or they've got them on the website. And where the rubber sort of meets the road is how are you operationalizing them? Because really what it is it's just, how do we behave? How do we behave as individuals showing up in our work environment every day? And if you don't operationalize them, really make it clear what the expectations on those behaviors are, if you don't hire for it, if you don't assess for it with promotions, if you don't exit people who cannot get there on those values, then there's sort of no point. And I think that's why it's minimized sometimes. I think that's why when you talk about it, it's like, a little bit of an eye roll and not considered the meaty stuff because of that.
One of the things I was trying to explore in the case was how those values not only related to your relationships with the team, but also to your clients, to these children and their families, and the obvious complex needs that they had. But I have to tell people what the values are, because on those usual walls, and everybody listening has seen them on the walls. I don't want to talk about CBS for the moment, but there's something like respect and integrity and perhaps a teamwork, and they're on a wall, or a PR agency has put it together. Yours are, you want to state them, or do you want me to?
Sure, no, I'm happy to. And I think just to tie into what you just said, it's how we show up for each other, but also having these values impacts the way that our families experience our care, right? And that's another really important part of it. So when we talk about these courageous leaders, right, it's got a huge impact on the families and how they experience us. We've got these young clinicians telling parents to change their parenting approach sometimes, right? Difficult conversations. And I believe, and we believe, that this values work that we've done and this development that we're doing with our people impacts them, and that families are getting more authentic relationships with those clinicians that can help them better formulate treatment plans and impact the outcomes of the kids. So I just want to put that out there also.
No, I think it's very important to put that out there. I mean, I think the relationship between the values and your marketplace and your customers, in this case, your families, your clients, is very important to accentuate here. It's not just sort of the internal relationships. All right, well, name the five. Name the five.
Sure. It's authenticity, it's growth, it's hustle, it's teamwork, and it's accountability. And I can go all day long into what each of them means and how we think of it.
Let's take hustle as one, because that, I think, you told me that had some controversial discussion about that word. So as an example, some companies have speed, and this is somewhat related to that, but I think it's interesting to hear that word, and then authenticity. Maybe just speak to each of those.
Sure. So hustle, I think the headline for hustle is, in autism and autism treatment, time matters, right? And if you think about what we do, every single person in our organization, whether they are in billing for the insurance companies, whether they are a clinician, whether it's a member of the executive team, it doesn't matter. What every single one of us is doing is moving these kids with autism towards a more meaningful and independent life. And the window, it gets more difficult. The window can narrow as far as big impacts. There are greater gains at earlier stages. So time matters. And everything that every one of us does, the hustle matters. And so that was a word that we debated endlessly. And we decided we didn't want to dilute everything down, right? Because some people have a negative reaction to that word. And it is one of those things that, some people who are great in other ways don't have it, and some people do. And it's an ability to be decisive, to move quickly, to prioritize the client. And we have specific behaviors that we ask of our employees to demonstrate that value. So that was hustle. Yeah, you have any questions, or you want me to go on to authenticity?
No, well, I'm gonna just do a little teaser, because
Sure.
I want everybody to be thinking about what Vicki just said in terms of what hustle means. And then just think about March 13th, the country's closing down, and these families' needs haven't gone away. And somehow decisions have to be made about whether we are still going into their homes, our clinicians. So don't answer that yet, because that's an important part of how you handle the pandemic crisis. But I think that's important. How about authenticity? And by the way, just say a word about Brene Brown, because you mentioned, I don't know that everybody knows Brene Brown. So just say who she is and how you came to her, and then maybe if the authenticity is related to that courage.
For Brene Brown, I encourage all of you to go check out Brene Brown. And probably the best place to start is her TED Talk on vulnerability. I think that's like a great starter course for Brene Brown. And she's a researcher who studies shame, vulnerability, and leadership, and has a leadership philosophy and a leadership training approach, which we implement at Acorn.
Okay, so then how did that? We'll maybe come back to a little bit more about how that plays itself out in the company. But authenticity.
Yeah.
How is that?
It's owning your strengths and weaknesses, don't pretending you've got it when you don't got it, right? You get to be the same, we're one person. We're each only one person. Like nobody wants to have a work self and a personal self. We get to be the same person in all areas of our life. And the way that we operationalize this is there's the vulnerability piece in it. You don't have to pretend to be something that you're not. So we literally have in the core values assessment an ability to ask for help, right? Someone who can say, I'm struggling with blank, right? You don't pretend you got it when you don't got it, right? So those are some of the attributes of the authenticity. It's like low posturing, low being the knower, and more being a learner.
When I say ask for help, I'm thinking about the old proverbial stereotype that men don't ask for directions or ask for help and women do. So I have to have a little parenthetical here. What percentage of the company, well, let's go to the executive team, are women? What percentage?
All but one. We have one fabulous man, our CFO, Jose Alvarez, but everyone else is a woman.
And overall across the company, in terms of the clinicians and the various other providers in the company, roughly?
I think we're probably running about 90% now, 90% women.
So do you, and that's, I'm in very, risky territory here, but do you think some of these values, are related to gender? I'm not quite sure what to say, preferences or abilities, skills, something. I don't know that I'm not trying to make a large statement, but it is so telling that the atmosphere that I've observed in your team feels different than 99% of the companies I'm dealing with, which are the opposite percentages of what you just said.
Wow.
And so I wonder whether even these values and the way in which you articulate them have something to do with the female nature of your team and your organization.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I mean, I have always had this, so probably not a coincidence. My old company in the eating disorder industry, which I built from the ground up with my co-founder, was probably the same numbers. So it's, again, kind of the water that I swim in. And I will tell you that certainly these women, these young professional women who are building their careers, really have expressed to me how much they appreciate the values, how it resonates with them. I think when you go to the authenticity value, for example, like nobody has to pretend that they're not a mom, right? That they don't have other demands coming at them, right? It's really so a part of our culture that we see the whole person and understand the demands of that and the experience of that. So maybe, I think certainly what has been expressed to me is it really resonates for them. And what's also been expressed to me is that they very much appreciate seeing a women-led company as well, right? So I think what you can see a lot of times is in certain sectors of healthcare where the clinicians are majority women, you see that, and then you see an executive team that is still all men, or mostly men. And I've heard a lot from them that they appreciate that it goes all the way to the top.
So you and I can quickly agree that women are the superior gender. We'll just we'll park that comment. I'm not going to do a poll, and I'm not going to open myself up into all sorts of things. But all right, we'll move forward. But here you just mentioned some things that I think leads me to my next question, which is about what you have called a rumble or the rumble. I don't know what the right way into it is, but Brene Brown has this concept of a rumble. And I was intrigued with that when we were writing the case to sort of explore what that meant, because it's part of the authenticity. It's part of the vulnerability. It's part of the, we bring our whole selves to work.
Yeah.
It's everything. All right. So when I think the word rumble, I think West Side Story, Jets and Sharks. I think about, people with, kind of fighting rumble. But I witnessed some of this because you've recorded some of these. And I'd like you to describe and maybe even reenact what for you was a typical kind of rumble conversation. It's really about a difficult conversation that you sanction and you yourself participate in with people so that it's not under the carpet or somehow suppressed. So tell us about the rumbles that you have.
So I will start by saying that I don't think there could be a single employee at Acorn who doesn't know that what we believe the most important skill of leadership is the ability to have the courageous conversations, right? So rumble, you can call it a rumble, you can call it a courageous conversation, you can call it a hard conversation. That language just lives everywhere within our organization. We speak to it, we train to it, we challenge on it. We consider it literally the leader of every single facility in the organization. We assess for a lot of things, but two things they got to be able to run their little operating center from a dashboard. They have to know how to do that, and they have to know how to have courageous conversations. I mean, it's just so fundamental. And I would say to the people who are listening today, if there's a single skill to work on, to develop in your career to be a better leader, it is that ability. So I can talk a long time about that, but I'll just tell you some examples. It's also, I think I should call out, I think what we see in most organizations, like it's that inability to have those conversations is, I believe, where the root of all dysfunction is, right? So things are not being said directly. It's the meeting before the meeting. It's the meeting after the meeting. It's the someone's not pulling their weight on a team. And instead of having a one-on-one conversation with that person, it's the back talk, right, among the other members of the team. Or maybe it's going to your boss to talk to them about it and complain. And then maybe they go to that person's boss. And right, that is where the dysfunction lives. And it's also a trust killer when things work that way, right? So I would say that all of these things that we're doing are in service of creating a psychologically safe environment, right? Which we know makes the most effective teams and creates an environment of trust. So I just have to, that's sort of foundationally. And then we are training to it all the time, because even really seasoned leaders, like I still struggle, right? I don't consider myself to have mastery of this yet. It's something that I'm still working on so much. So I think one of the ones that we've done in our training sessions, and I typically do them with our COO and Chief Clinical Officer, Krista Bowe. She and I do these together. And we do I know you
I know, because Krista, I go ahead. It's a great pairing to have the two of you doing this.
Yeah, thank you. And so one of the ones that we did for the group, right, to model, and then we have them role play and practice. And we typically try to do some that are like hard for the group to see. This is what it really looks like. This is the language that we use. This is how we approach it. And
so you're doing this in this particular instance, you're describing something you do publicly in front of the group to model for them how to have these conversations and help train them in that skill.
That's exactly right. She and I lead training at every level of the company on this skill. We talk about it all the time, right? So we think this is the most important skill. And we have conversations, like one of the ones that we did was Krista had her first child I think her baby was born on March 5th. And as we know, like a couple things happened right after, right? Right. So she's on maternity leave with her first child as the world is imploding. And then when she came back, and I, like, she's our COO and I hugely respect her and value her. I knew that like it was scary, right? And previously her job had required a lot of travel. And in those early months of COVID, we didn't know what's the impact on small children. Like it was just a really scary time if we look back on it. And so in my desire to help and to support, one of the things that I did, really almost not even consciously, is I started saying like, you know what, we don't have to pull Krista into this, right? Like if it was an initiative that was going to require some travel, right? It's okay. Krista doesn't need to do it. We don't need to pull her into this. It's okay. And in my desire to protect, basically what our rumble was that we did in front of everyone was her talking to me about feeling marginalized by like, even though my intentions were good, I was essentially marginalizing her, right? Like she's a grown-ass woman, right? A senior executive, and she can set her own boundaries. and ask for what she needs and say yes and no to what is okay and what's not okay. And basically she doesn't need me kind of preemptively removing her in order to protect her. And we did that in front of everyone. And I think that
she was feeling that. And the important point of Vicki, so she was feeling herself being marginalized, moved out of the sort of center that she was once in.
That's right.
And she voiced this to you.
That's right.
And again, then you had this conversation. So continue. So we're on the edge of our seats. How did it get resolved?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically her saying, I feel marginalized, and my saying, like, my intention was this. That's not what I want. And she asked me to allow her to not pre-screen for her, right? To treat her the same as she had been treated before in her role. And that she would set her own boundaries on it and did not want me doing it for her. And it was really good. And again, I think it's not something, I think it happens a lot, right? I think sometimes you see women coming back from maternity leave and, maybe there's not a sensitivity to it, but I think also there's the opposite, which is what I was doing, right? Like I was being very sensitive to it, but not handling it in the right way. And she called me out on it. And I think we modeled for all those women in our company, this is what this looks like. It's okay to have these conversations.
And there's a Indian company called HCL, which built a system, which is that if a person had some sort of a grievance or issue, the issue had to be resolved within 24 hours from the point of view of the person that had the issue, not from the point of view of the bosses or whatever. The idea was not to let things fester.
That's right.
And issues of all kind, whether it be I didn't get my paycheck on time or whether it be, I feel marginalized or whatever it was. So the it of this story is one, the example of women coming back from maternity leave is a specific subset, but it's really any issues. I assume there are work issues, there are issues with the families or whatever, where there are differences, but the idea is don't keep them inside. Get them out.
I think I read somewhere, like you can sort of gauge the health of an organization by the gap between when you're feeling it and when you're saying it and when you're speaking it, right? And I think that is certainly how we see it. So we are trying to accelerate those conversations, and they can be everything from why did that person get a promotion and I didn't, right? To I feel like too much is being asked of me and not enough is being asked of my peer. It's all of the stuff. It's at an executive leadership level, right? Again, I think what you see in a lot of organizations is avoidance, right? Under the table, posturing, all of that stuff. And that is where the dysfunction lives. And I see, as a CEO, I believe that my number one job is to create the environment for a high performing, high functioning, healthy dynamics executive team. And my number two job is making sure that those executive leaders are doing the same the layer down. Like that, if I get those two things right, then the company's probably going to do pretty well.
So let's go there to what happened then with the pandemic, because you were building out the company with this sort of DNA architecture, with an ethos. I have an exhibit in the case, which is actually the glossary of words, the language that you've built in for people to be able to have not only these conversations, but do all the issues that you're addressing, but in, again, I think a very specific way to Acorn Health with that vocabulary. I want to, for the moment, move forward because all of that was developing and strengthening. And in fact, you were just announcing the values, and then came March 13th. I mean, leave aside Krista. Poor Krista was off, returning from maternity leave. But the notion of all of these ways in which you were kind of together as a team, building something out, and then a pandemic happens. And the question of, well, what's, first of all, you're going to be able to stay open? Can you still serve your families? Yeah. Number two, can you keep all the people on the payroll? Yeah. Because, you mentioned in the beginning, but we haven't come back to it. This is a PE sponsored controlled firm. So all of what you're talking about is in the context of PE. My students will tell you, we're not going to be seeing a lot of that in PE instances where you have this kind of soft stuff. We'll see the scorecard, but we don't necessarily see all of this. So you've got a PE firm looking over your shoulder in terms of bottom line.
Yeah.
And you've got this culture, the t-shirts have been printed, the plaques are ready to go out, the balloons are on, the values, everything's all that. And now it's March 13th. So take us to that leadership moment and sort of how you fared through that. And then I'm soon going to open it up to questions. So I'm going to ask people to ask questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'm keeping going because there's lots more here.
Yeah.
Tell us about March 13th and beyond the pandemic.
Ooh, scary time for all of us, right? Our big questions were, it's a very immature industry. It's an early stage industry. So there were not the norms and expectations that you see in some other healthcare sectors, right? So one thing was staying open or not staying open, right? There was not cohesion in the industry on how to approach that. Again, I go back to, it was a really early stage industry. In my prior world, other areas of behavioral healthcare and eating disorders and substance abuse, they know they're essential healthcare providers. So of course we're staying open. People's needs do not, quite to the contrary, I think we know now, they actually have really increased during this time, those needs. And I would say the same is true of our families with children with autism. This has not been a period where things have gotten easier for them. It's gotten significantly harder, right? So, but we were on our own a little on the decision about whether to stay open or not, just all kinds of conflicting information. And I would say a big takeaway lesson that I had there is I will always have a external advisory board in the future, because that external advisory board really had an impact on how we worked our way through those decisions, right? On what to do and what not to do.
Those were business people or medical clinicians on the external board?
But external, I think, is a really key part of it. Clinical advisors,
okay,
right, who really understood the inner workings of our company and what we were trying to build, but had that outsider objective view to guide us on, ooh, I'm getting an echo all of a sudden. I don't know why.
We're not hearing it.
You're not hearing it? Perfect.
No.
So that was one important takeaway there. The second really huge challenge is, again, yes, we were a startup company. We were an early stage company and had been investing in building something, had this private equity partner, but we had a lot of expectations placed on us. It was not a blank check. And a lot of employees that we were responsible for. So that was another huge thing that was impacting us. And then, as you mentioned, third big thing was probably this beautiful culture that we had been building and some of the hard decisions that we were going to have to make. How did that align with those? And how could we navigate a crisis while still holding on to all those things that we had been building and saying we are and that we wanted to be?
And where was the PE owners on this issue? Were they, well, I guess I've got two questions about PE and where was competition? Because I think some competition closed their doors.
Many
did. And they said, we cannot physically send our people out of safety concern to those families. And telehealth was a
telehealth. I mean, we have probably about 10% now that's telehealth. It's a minority of the clients. It's a minority of the treatment. So it's not the solution in this sector for all the reasons that we all can understand, right? We're dealing with very young children. We're helping really young kids. So telehealth was not going to be the big solution for us. I would say probably majority closed. In some fashion. And we deliver our care both in centers, right? Majority of our care is done in centers and some is done in homes. And so does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that there was, your people were seeing some of these competitors close up, and some of them, I'm sure some of your people were also concerned about their own well-being. Yeah. As you said, when we're talking about March of 2020, the ability to understand what we were encountering and the risks associated with the risks on so many levels. But, you as a leader having to preside over that decision, to have the team agree that you would stay open and send people to homes with safety precautions and whatever, was a very big decision. And I guess
really big, really scary decision. That's back in the era. If we look back, the things we didn't know, it's like, that's when they were saying, don't use masks.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's how crazy it was back then. We forget. And And for us, we had families that were, their schools were closing down, right? The resources were disappearing. And we had families that really, really needed us. We also understood that for some of our staff, it was not going to be the right choice for lots of different reasons, and we were going to support them through that. There was definitely not an energy of judgment if you weren't going to continue delivering care. We understood, but we were going to stay open, march on, work with our families who really needed our care, and we had to make some cost cuts. It got very scary for a while. It was a really scary time. And I think that what we've talked about before, which was one of my sort of personal lessons, that I went further on transparency and visibility into the financials of our company, further down into the organization than I ever have in my career. So that was a big sort of learning experience for me. We involved everyone in our challenge.
So authenticity is also related to transparency and to being real with people. And you actually brought people the real nitty gritty about how the company was faring in these conditions and forecasts that some of them did not look too good.
Yeah.
On the balance sheet.
It was scary. I mean, it was really terrifying. Also, it was changing so rapidly. So not only was it hard, but like you could feel like, okay, this is really hard and here's our plan. And then by the time I woke up the next morning, something else had imploded and it was just all different, right? It was just changing every single day. And for us, the engaging the people all the way on the ground, we had a daily huddle. We showed every one of our leaders, again, on the ground, somebody who's owning one of these individual little facilities in a community, showing the numbers to them, showing them where the budget was. And like the budget was a green line. Before that, we had been above it and we had a red line. And what they all knew, and we had daily numbers that we were reporting, and what they knew that if we went below that red line, that we would have to do bigger cuts and layoffs. And but the benefit of sharing that was that they also knew that if we stayed even a little bit above that red line, and collectively, right, that we could survive it and that they didn't have to worry about the phone call coming or the tap on their shoulder where they would be laid off and losing their jobs.
I mean, it was the proverbial classic tension between serving the shareholders and looking where that red and green line was, serving your clients, these families, and serving your employees. And you've mentioned all three in the last 5 minutes of the conversation. So you were cognizant of all three, but I'm sure at times it felt like, well, if we move in one direction, we might do a disservice to one or another of these stakeholders. Yeah. So
I will say one other thing, just tied to your PE question,
yeah,
Jick, and that is that one thing is our partners have relationships and talk to other PE groups and investment bankers, and they did have some insight into how other companies were doing during that phase. So they had an appreciation for how we were managing it. So they were not intrusive in that way. Like, I think they were impressed with how we were navigating it compared to some other big PE groups who have invested in the sector.
So I have to do a shout out now to one of my former students, a CBS alum, Preston Bryce, who was a member of that PE
right there
team,
with us. That's right.
Class of 13 CBS. And Preston was one of the ones who reached out to me about doing this case study. But I do think, Vicki, that's an important factor in this. And again, fits my unusual. I don't think that's a conventional PE solution. It's more, what you're doing is more long-term focus to build out this sort of foundation. And that's typically not as well associated with the PE. So that's an important factor in this.
Right.
So let me ask you one other question, and before we sort of do some wrap questions, I want to just come back to the values and the culture and this moment of the pandemic, because you alluded to it. I mean, there are sometimes companies that say, we're fine with these values in peacetime. When it comes to wartime, we got to let that go. I mean, we got some better things to do when it comes to wartime. This was a wartime moment. I mean, it was as I described, the term VUCA. I mean, this was sort of the unknowns cubed. So what was in your constitution that you as a leader said, we are not forsaking these values. We're going to actually use them to help us make the tough decisions. And they were tough. All those decisions that we describe in the case were tough decisions. So how did you keep that North Star so prominent through this period?
I think it's all the same principles, really, right? So the vulnerability piece, which is like the foundation of the Brene Brown leadership work, and that's tied to that transparency. I told people, these are our challenges right now, right? This is what we have to do, and we need to all take it on together. And I really, in retrospect, I think that it was probably a time where tremendous trust was built in the organization as a result of it. I think it's easy to espouse all these things when things are really good. But when you have gone through the fire with people, it sort of solidifies them in a different way.
Well, that's certainly taking the long view to appreciate that, it was worth the anchoring in those values for the trust, because otherwise, again, that whole exercise would have been seen as shallow and essentially false, because, again, if you just do it in peacetime but not in wartime, it doesn't really mean that much. Let me get to a few sort of final reflections on this. Again, if there are some questions, please send them forward. We have about 10 minutes left. There's some entrepreneurs, I'm sure, among the audience thinking about startups and the like. You've been a part of a few of them. You sort of have a unique position, also as a member of the, having some PE ownership. But what's your advice about startups and building out companies and this kind of effort to make the leadership model so critical and the cultural foundation so critical? In a sense, the name of the Reuben Mark Initiative is organizational character. This organization has character. I've experienced and saw many videos of your group in action. It is not, again, your sort of typical. So what advice do you have for entrepreneurs about this?
Oh gosh, I have so much advice in different ways for entrepreneurs. I think that you have to invest in the people stuff. When I look back at all my mistakes and the most impactful mistakes that I've made, it all is in the people work, right? Like, you have to know what those values are and how you're going to work together and what kind of team you're building and what kind of company you're building, and hold people to that standard. I think that everybody gets very focused on the technical skills required to perform, and we can really fall in love with a candidate or an employee who's got killer technical skills. Every time I have seen it not work, right, or regretted hiring or regretted holding on to someone for longer than I should have, every single time it was behavioral and not technical. I think most companies, most people listening are going to be really good at assessing for those technical skills. It's not that. It's always in my experience, it's always the behavioral. So
do you put a lot of time and effort then into hiring to see you get the right people? And when you're acquiring, have you forsaken certain companies because you feel like they're not going to be a cultural fit, or been attracted to others? What role does it play in hiring and in acquiring?
Yeah, it's critical. So we assessed for it. So we, in the same way that we have operationalized those core values in terms of the how they need to be behavioralized, we have questions that we ask in an interviewing process, right? Some of my favorite ones are asking someone to talk about, for example, like, tell us about a time that you had a challenging work relationship with someone, with a peer. How did you handle it? How did you wish that you handled it, right? How would you handle it now? Would you do it differently? And what that gets to sometimes is the self-awareness piece, which is really foundational to some of these things. So we ask a lot of those questions. And then we also sort of, just to have context around it, we're obviously doing all the technical skill assessment, but for us, it's really core values are the first box that has to be checked. Then it's the will. Does the person, like, understanding the role and the will to do it and the desire to do it, right? Like, that's key for promotions and hires. And then we assess for the skill, because if you don't have those first two things, we don't go forward.
So I see a couple of interesting questions that have come out, and I want to ask you about both of them. One is, as the economy reopens more fully and some of your competitors come back to the market, do you find that your employees will be or are more loyal to Acorn as a result of how you handled the crisis? What's going to, because one of the things you also told me is that this is not, there's not a large volume of the
clinicians, the
clinicians
right,
that you are seeking out. So you want to get this right. You need to retain them. Do you think this will have helped, or will they just sort of start playing off of different competitors?
I think that there's a tremendous amount of loyalty in those leaders that we did some hard things. We didn't touch on it here, but we did a 10% pay cut across the board for all of our salaried employees, not our hourly employees, but for all of our salaried employees. And then we were really blessed because we were able to return it to everyone at the end of the year. But I believe it will create increased engagement. I think it creates trust. Right? That's the psychological safety stuff that I talk about. There's a dynamic of trust because we were so transparent that they believe us, they trust us that we're going to say it straight. So I believe so.
By the way, I don't want people to miss that passing point about the fact that you actually as a group agreed on a 10% cut across the board,
including executives. Yep.
Rather than, sort of sacrifice certain individuals and everybody else is whole. But then you returned the money.
We did.
To them, 6-8 months later.
Yes,
and
yes.
I've seen the video of you doing that, announcing that. And, my students in Advanced Org Change were almost brought to tears seeing that, of how that was so congruent with what you were doing. A student asked, Ian Manley, one of my students, says, you mentioned evaluating employees for how they exhibit core values. How do you assess them? Do you do it every year? And what are the performance metrics?
Yep. So we have the behavioral interviewing questions that we ask around all the core values, and it's some of the stuff that I just touched on, right? So it's really getting to some of that stuff and how that, it's not going to be a yes or no kind of question. It's the behavioral stuff around, tell us about a time that you didn't hit a goal, right?
That's the accountability.
Yeah. Tell us what that looked like. Tell us how you handled it, right? And if you have someone that only is going to go to the place of well, my greatest weakness is I'm a perfectionist and I always get it right? If that's the kind of stuff that they're going to give you, then that's probably not going to be a fit for us, because that is not an ability to demonstrate self-awareness, right? That's we have a long list of questions for each of those core values and what that behavior looks like.
So that gives it teeth that you, and also that's a sort of learning organization, because you're having conversations about, as you said, it's not a yes, no, it's not a score, it's a conversation. Somebody asked an interesting question. I've heard the advice, hire slow and fire fast in terms of addressing behavioral issues. How do you build a team where people feel they can make a mistake, but at the same time let go of people quickly whose values don't align? Because I know you also have let go of people along the way. How do you fire fast without hurting the team morale?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that, what I was saying just a moment ago about the technical skill is where we get all tied up in knots. We're pretty good at that. Most of us are pretty good at that. It's, and if we get it wrong with someone, we can usually get them there. So the example that I gave a little while ago, right? The most important position in our entire organization is that on the ground individual site leader, right? Because you've got a person who's typically a clinician who is leading the team, right? So they've got to have clinical skills, they've got to have leadership skills because they're owning a team, and they're really owning their little business, right? They've got to have operational and business skills. It's a lot. And when the things that they must have, right? The clinical is the foundational, but sort of the leadership and management skills they must have are that the courageous conversation skill and the ability to manage a business through a dashboard. But on that assessment process that we use, we literally have a grid, right, for those leaders or those up and coming leaders. And it's the core value assessment, right? It's plus or minus or a plus minus. And you can have, you can't have any minuses. You can have 2 plus minuses and we can work on, right? And plus minus means sometimes or most of the time, but not always. And this is where your work is. They've got to have the will. They have to really understand the demands of the job and want it. And then we go into the skill. And the most important skill is the courageous conversations. And the dashboard one, which is the one that most of us would typically be focusing on, what we've experienced is it's the easiest one to get there. It's so much easier to get people there on their dashboard skills than it is to shift someone who doesn't have the core values or doesn't have the courageous conversation skills.
So that's why you scrutinize that carefully, and that's again more publicly understood. So everybody knows that's kind of how we do things around Acorn Health.
Right, because also, let me just say one more thing. You can't, all those core values, none of them work if you can't have the foundation of the courageous conversations. How do you hold someone accountable if you don't know how to say, like, hey, we talked about this and this isn't happening in the way that we agreed to, and I need to understand why, and I need to know what we're going to do to address it. If you don't know how to do that and you're not comfortable with that, then all the other stuff starts falling apart.
I mean, you say that with such clarity, Vicki. I have to say, I work with CEOs who are so ambivalent about that 2x2, about results and values. And the notion, again, that, your dashboard is sort of the results and the values is the courageous conversation. And where somebody, gets the results and can do the courageous conversation, it's easy. Where they don't get the results, they don't have the courageous conversation. It's easy. What's hard are those other two quadrants where they have the values, but they don't get the results, or they have the results and they don't have the values. And you're saying we err on the side of people who have the values are going to be higher order keepers in our world. We'll train them on the dashboard.
Yep, because also remember, Professor Jick, our values are also things like accountability, right? Yep. That's a results orientation. That's a delivering for what you agreed to deliver in your role. Hustle, right? It's moving to make that necessary changes quickly. So it's not just the soft stuff. It's not just feel good stuff, right? The values are showing up for your teammates and delivering what you agreed to.
All right, we've got a minute. I've got one audience question and one of mine, so you got 30 seconds on each. First one is, how do you get buy-in from others, potential acquisition partners, PE firm, et cetera, on the importance of emphasizing the people side of the business, your basic ethos? How do you continue to have that, build that bridge with who you acquire?
We need so much time for that one. I would say from the PE perspective, when we talk about that stuff, results buy you, the results get you buy-in from PE, right? So it's as simple as that. I've never had any challenges or pushback from my partners on our values, and we're a business that delivers. If we were not—
As long as you're delivering. If you weren't delivering and you had the values, you'd probably get pushback.
Yeah, and I think depending on the partner, there are always going to be times where you're not delivering, right? We got a pandemic. We weren't doing exactly what we thought we would at the beginning of that because the world was blowing up, right? But when you have delivered, it buys you a little trust to continue. So I would say with that, and with the acquisitions, we have had some hard lessons there. So it's a really interesting question. And we're doing some things differently now in terms of how we integrate those new groups into our culture. We go through a cultural assessment process where we really look at the values, and surprise, surprise, where the gaps show up in the cultural assessment are around the accountability and the hustle. Not a surprise, right?
Let me just ask you just a quick closing, and then we got to close off, which is about kind of just a final piece of advice to our audience about kind of what you've learned. You and I have talked about this, and the term self-awareness keeps coming up, but self-awareness is not a piece of jargon for you. It's really accepting your weaknesses as well as your strengths. Just say a word about that as sort of a closing thought to everyone.
It's the foundation to everything. If you don't know what your sweet spot is, if you don't know what's really hard for you, if you don't know your strengths and your weaknesses, you can't speak to them. You'll find yourself in situations where you're either really unhappy in your role or you've overshot. I'll just say really fast, we do lots of tools that we use to help people understand that. We use the Gallup Strengths Finders. We use the Enneagram. We do lots of things to help people kind of get to know themselves better, the identification of their own personal core values. All of that is in support of that self-awareness, which helps with all of these leadership skills.
Well, Vicki, we invited you here today because I think it's very consistent with what we're doing with the Reuben Mark Initiative, which fortunately sponsored this case and gives us a chance to learn more about it now in a one-on-one with you, and hopefully for years to come with the case study, because of your commitment to that very kind of ethos of the importance of those cultural issues, the so-called soft stuff, which is the hard stuff, and living it, not just preaching it, but living it. You're doing the training, you're doing the onboarding, you're doing the rumbles, you're involved with all these things. You are also managing the business, making money, growing, building a model. You have sponsors, you have owners that want some return, and you're doing it all. And for that, we are extremely appreciative of your time and the insights that you gave us today. I hope everyone enjoyed the hour as much as I did, and hopefully you did, Vicki. Olivia, I'm assuming I have the last word, or do you have a last word beyond that? I think.
Thank you so much, by the way, for that. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Vicki. Lots that you taught us today. Olivia, close us down.
Yes. Well, both, thank you so much, Professor Jick and Vicki. Wow, what an incredible hour. Such key, tangible takeaways, and just inspirational humanistic leadership at its finest. So thank you so much to both of you for bringing this conversation to Columbia University through the Reuben Mark Initiative. And we have many more events to come in this semester. So we'll be sending out a calendar of events, but thank you both for joining us. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us, and have a great and safe afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
All right, Vicki, we'll be in touch. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for everything today. Appreciate it.